Continuing with reading my English translation of the Quran, I'm still reading chapter 2, which is the account of the Heifer of Israel. I will now read verses 236 to 251. You would not be violating anyone's rights if you broke up your engagement to a woman without having had an encounter of intimacy with her. You can also break up an unconsummated marriage with a woman and expect no repercussions if you had not committed yourself to giving her a dowry. When you propose to a woman, she expects to receive something of a material nature to confirm your intention. Give women the pleasure of material gifts even if you did not consummate the marriage. A man of measurable means should compensate a woman according to his means, and a man of limited means is only expected to give what he can afford. Your compensation should be reasonable and in line with society's standards. A man of good moral character who intends to break up with a woman is expected to honor her right to compensation. If you break up your engagement to a woman and you never had any encounters of intimacy with her, but you had already committed yourself to giving her a dowry, then you should give her half of that amount. A woman or an agent representing her interests in a marriage contract may choose to drop this claim. Releasing a man from this obligation and granting him a pardon in this context is a virtue that will bring you closer to moral righteousness. You should always be mindful of the favors that you can give to each other to improve the general goodwill in your community. Nothing ever escapes God's attention, and His watchful eye sees what you do at any time. Maintain the schedule of your regular prayers throughout the day, and pay special attention to that session in the middle of the day's time cycle. Rise to the call of God with utter devotion to make your connection with Him, and without expressions of apathy and indifference. When you detect the threat of a nearby enemy, you may perform your prayers as you walk in an upright position. You can also say your prayers in a sitting position if you are riding on the back of a tamed animal. When conditions of security had been restored, you may resume performing your prayers in the normal manner. Proclaim the highness of the one Spirit in control of all things in creation, Allah, the Lord your God, and recite His words in the prayer ritual that He had taught you to perform. It is the type of spiritual knowledge that you had not been taught before. A dying man who has a wife that he expects to leave behind should bequeath to her in his last will and testament some certain benefits. His estate should provide the widow with her living expenses up to a year after his death, and no one should have the right to evict her from her house during that time. If a widow chooses to leave on her own volition before the first anniversary of her husband's death, then you, the guardians, would not be violating anybody's rights when you allow her the freedom to fulfill her marital desires, as long as her actions remained in line with society's moral standards. God, the Spirit of equity in all people, Allah, is supremely authoritative, and His rulings offer a cure to social ailments. Divorced women have a legitimate right to claim reasonable living expenses in line with society's normal standards. A man who wants to avoid any wrongdoing with a woman is expected to honor her right to compensation. This is how the God of all, the Spirit of sound judgment in all people, Allah, reveals His existence through His rulings. His verses provide you with a dialogue to make sense of your incoherence and irrational tendencies. How do you see the plight of those people who had fled their homeland in droves, fearing for their lives? God ruled that they had to control their neurotic instincts of self-preservation. They had to overcome their debilitating fear of death, which was killing them. As they overcame their incessant insecurities, He breathed the spirit of freedom into their soul, and they started living again. God has certainly treated humanity with favoritism, and He should be acknowledged for that. He is owed a debt of gratitude, but most people do not feel that they have to express their appreciation to Him. You have to put up a fight for the cause of God, Allah, the spirit of common good, and you have to resist your fears of death. You should also know that God, the Spirit in control of our united soul, has heard your voices that beg for life. He is well aware of your love for living. Who among you is willing to give to the spirit of charity? Who among you is willing to give to the Lord of all riches, Allah, alone from the goodness of his own soul? When you get your money back, God will have made it a double of what it was, and then multiplied it many times over. The Lord our God holds in his hand the power over all providence. His fist tightens when it comes to some people, and to some others it extends wide open. He is the spirit of existence, and in the end your souls will be delivered back to him. In what light do you see the behavior of the highest leadership layer, of those tribes that claimed they had descended from the man named Israel? This is what happened in later times after Moses. They said to a prophet that was sent to them, "Raise up a king for us from the people who will lead us in the fight to defend the spirit of humanity, Allah, the God of all." He said to them, "Are you worried that you would cower in fear if you were thrust into battle?" They answered, "Nothing would prevent us from defending our right to life and fighting for the one spirit that unites us all, the God Allah, now that we had been exiled from the lands of our ancestors and separated from our kin." But when war imposed itself on them, when they were thrust into battle, most of them, except for a handful, turned their back in flight. God, the protector of the spirit of humanity, knows the people who have a dark, corrupt soul, prone to evil. He knows who they are. He knows the identities of the oppressors of human rights. Then their prophet said to them, "The God your Lord had raised Saul up from the people as a king for you." They said, "What gives him the right to be king over us, while some of us may have more compelling claims to the throne? Besides that, he was not provided with the virtue of a great fortune." He said, it was the Lord your God who had chosen him over you. He gave him an advantage in knowledge and physical features. The Lord our God may empower any person whom he chooses to rule in his dominion. He is tolerant and knowledgeable. His science of governance allows for dissent and discourse, and his power to contain these forces is immeasurably expansive. So then their prophet said to them, "There will be a divine sign pointing to the legitimacy of his appointment as king. He will bring you the ark that represents a symbolic dwelling of the Spirit of your Lord. It contains some ancient remains left by the descendants of Moses and Aaron. It will be carried to you by angels. If you honestly believe in your Lord, you will see this as a true sign from him." Saul marched the troops out towards the battle that awaited them. When they reached the front, he made a speech saying, "The Lord our God, the Spirit in control of the emotions in your heart, Allah, is about to put your faith in him to the test. This inviting river will test the stillness in your souls, It will test your willpower to calm your turbulent emotions. If you indulge yourself in its flowing waters and drink to your heart's content, you are not of my fiber. If you are not swayed by the sweetness of its bait, you will have proven that you are of me, and that you will be with me. A cupped handful that merely wets your whistle will not be considered self-indulgence. But save a few, they all took the bait and indulged themselves to their heart's content. When he and the remaining faithful troops had crossed the river of turbulent waters to the other side, they assessed the situation and then said, "On this day we appear to be of no match to the power of Goliath and his army." But another group made a different assessment. They were the ones that did not mind that their day with God had come. They said, "By the grace and will of God, how many times in the past had the band of the few united defeated the band of the many who were divided?" God, the Spirit of might in all creation, Allah, the Almighty, will be with the people who had persevered in the trial of their turbulent emotions, then persisted in the pursuit of their purpose. And when they took up their position for combat with Goliath and his army, they prayed, saying, "Dear Lord, on this day we ask you to fill the emptiness in our soul with a bold spirit of endurance and unwavering perseverance, to anchor our feet firmly in the ground where we stand, and to hand us victory over the insurgents who had risen against their Lord's divine authority." So they defeated their enemy, and David killed Goliath, because of the authorization they had obtained from the greatest of deities, God, the spirit that owns all that happens to a life it had created, Allah. He empowered David with a sense of ownership of the Spirit and a moral authority to rule over the people's collective soul. And of the Word he read to him all that he wanted to teach him. So he learned how the willpower of his Lord had worked. God has to push some people to stand up and fight other people, so he could limit the corruption of man's moral character. Morality and justice in governing the earth would have been totally perverted if it weren't for the Lord's intervention. Man's civilization, past and present, can be attributed to God's favoritism, and every person's world is indebted to his ever-flowing providence.